You are viewing one of 10 modules developed through a project funded by Geoscience BC focused on direct use geothermal resources in British Columbia. This follow-up project was carried out between August and December 2016. The project was executed by Gator Geocorp. These modules were developed from the Direct Use Geothermal Resources Roadmap published by Geoscience BC in June 2016. They incorporate additional educational material that were developed as part of the current follow-up project. The voices you will hear narrating the module are myself, Catherine Hickson, and my colleague, Juliana Proenza.
Hello everyone, welcome back. We are currently going to be going through Module 6, which is the Permitting Overview module. Now, some of the things that we're going to be dealing with in this module is why the community-based participatory approach is important during the permitting process, and then some of the land considerations that you have to take into account prior to your permitting needs. And then we'll just go through some of the details in terms of how the BC Land Act, the BC Water Sustainability Act, and the BC Geothermal Resources Act are regulated and administered by the province. So the community-based participatory approach is essentially just getting the word out to communities that this development is an option and worth looking at. And when looking at direct use in particular, you can evaluate the heating needs for different developments, facilities, industry, commercial businesses in the area, and that can really help out in terms of why exploring for this resource is important and how the community can benefit in terms of environmental and economic benefits to the community. And what this approach really facilitates is building community capacity, building relationships within the community and any partnerships, raising awareness to the resource development of geothermal direct use projects, and paving the way for future community engagements as potential projects may take off. And what this really does in the long term is allows the development of identified resources to go ahead and move forward. Generally, geothermal direct use projects will have a great amount of difficulty progressing without community support. So it goes without saying that community champion, as we've mentioned before, is extremely important to have a team in place that moves these types of projects forward. So as an example, we've got Valemount, which is currently considering a geopark and a resort area for a hot spring, and down the road looking at a power plant development there. And so the community there essentially has a direct use committee that has been put together with representatives from the community that are interested in furthering this development. They also have a geothermal society that represents the voices in the community that would like to see this type of resource developed. And so that's really important to have something like that, and that just shows you, one way to go about it. And the way that they've chosen is to really build a team of community members that are committing to be involved in the development process of this resource. So as with oil and gas and mineral rights, the province of BC has jurisdiction over provincial, crown land, water, and geothermal rights. Consultations with First Nations and communities are necessary at the outset of projects that impact land and resource decisions, and these consultations usually continue on through the development process of a project. So some of the land considerations that you have to take into account are the official First Nation reserve lands. There are territorial lands that are recognized by the government, but there are also asserted territorial lands that still need to be considered, and it is to the benefit to all communities nearby and the First Nations that are asserting territory in that area for partnerships to occur and for the First Nations to facilitate the development of a project that is on their asserted territory. For Crown land, 94% of the provincial land area is Crown land, so typically that's what you will most likely be dealing with. And if you're dealing with private land, then that complicates things a little bit further, because then you will have to consult the private landowner and make sure that you put in agreements in place for exploration and development. Other considerations are if there are lands that are part of the agricultural land reserve, protected land areas such as parks, and we've already mentioned privately owned land there. So here is an overview of the asserted First Nation territories in BC. So some of the boundaries here may change over time as First Nations work together to define their boundaries or what areas are shared. And so that's why you see that there are no defined linear boundaries on this map. They're fuzzy essentially, and that really shows you that there is overlap between the asserted territories of the First Nations that inhabit the land. We've got a couple maps here representing what's Crown and private land and what regions are within the agricultural land reserve. Now for the BC Land Act, basically this gives a proponent the permission to use Crown land, and this process is regulated under the Land Act, which is administered by the Ministry of Forests, Lands and Natural Resources, and you've got the website link right there. These policies establish principles on how the land can be used, allocated, what the tenure terms are, what the pricing is, and all other aspects associated with Crown land. So Crown land uses are broad and varied and include things such as aquaculture, industrial uses, commercial uses, recreation, etc. So often the end-use applications for direct-use geothermal resource will include these types of uses. So in order to go through the BC Land Act permitting process, there is a tool called Gator, which is Government Access Tool for Online Retrieval. And what this does is it allows registered users to use the internet to interactively view, extract, and print information from the Crown Land Registry. So another thing that's important is to evaluate if any other individuals or proponents have water rights in the area. And depending on the intended use, services, and the required tenure term, an application for surface rights to access provincial Crown land can be made through the Front Counter BC website for a land use license. In particular, for direct use projects, the land use permit would fall under the Industrial General Program, and this program covers things like aquaculture, greenhouses, etc. There are three types of tenures under the Industrial General Program. There is a license that's a temporary license and can be issued up to 2 years, and this authorizes a temporary use, such as the exploratory stage of a project. So things like collecting data and non-invasive exploration. So if you're going out and doing geophysical surveys, or geological mapping, collecting soil samples, collecting biogeochemistry samples, so taking samples of tree bark, for example, those things would fall under this type of tenure. Then the next stage is a license of occupation. So once you've identified that there is potential and you'd like to continue work in the area, you can apply for this type of license, which gives you a 10-year term. And what this does is that it allows you to have a longer term to continue exploration, but it does not require long-term certainty in terms of the project development. And so if you don't want to incur the cost of a legal survey and no significant land use improvements are intended yet, this license will do. And then once you have, when we went through modules 2 and 3 and identified the point of going forward with a project where you've done all of the pre-feasibility, the feasibility study, and evaluated the resource characteristics and are moving ahead with the project, then you would want to have this permit in place, which is a 30-year term and is issued where substantial improvements to the land are to be made and where boundaries are necessary in order to avoid conflicts with neighboring operators. So one thing to note is that once a project is at the point of drilling a water well or using water for any purpose that is not household use, a lease under the Industrial General Program of the Land Act is required in order to obtain a water license. Once more information is known about what type of projects a direct use resource can be developed for, more specific permits are required depending on that intended use. Now, to go through some of the permitting process requirements for the BC Water Sustainability Act, basically, water resources in BC are now regulated under the Water Sustainability Act, which was recently put into force in February of 2016 and replaces the previous Water Act. It's administered by the Ministry of Environment, and so one of the significant changes that was introduced by the Water Sustainability Act, or the WSA, is that you are now required to be authorized to use groundwater for anything other than household use, as I mentioned. So what that does is that it allows the province to regulate groundwater use and allows surface water and groundwater to be managed and protected as one interconnected resource. And it really strives to clarify the rights for groundwater users, and we're currently in a phase where users that are using groundwater for non-household use have a 2 or 3 year period in order to register their well and the specific details associated with that process. The authority to divert and use surface or groundwater is obtained by a license or approval in accordance with the statutory requirements of the WSA. So in order to obtain approval for any type of water well drilling or water use, as I mentioned, the necessary land tenure requirements must be fulfilled. So the water permitting and the land use permitting really does go hand in hand, and you want to make sure that those permits are in place or the permits are submitted concurrently, basically anticipating that you will need one for the other and vice versa. So the Water Sustainability Act is administered on a first-in-time, first-in-right system. So what that means is that senior licensees, those with the earliest priority dates, have precedence over junior licensees, regardless of the purpose for which the water is used. So if you are looking at developing a project where there is already substantial water use, it will be more difficult for that project to go ahead because you will need to establish that your project is not going to be conflicting with the water use of the projects nearby. And if you cannot establish that, then your project may not go ahead. So some of the things that a water license specifies are things like the water source or the purpose for the water use, what's the maximum quantity of the water that is going to be used, what are the associated works, the different components that are installed with the system for using the water, and where the water is going to be used. And through this process, it is possible to apply for more than one water use purpose. So we've just got here the list of what the license specifies that we just went through in the previous slide, and I just wanted to add that there is a possibility of a short-term water use, which is referred to as a use approval, which authorizes the holders to use water for a period of up to 24 months. Currently, under the WSA, you need a certified qualified well drillers or qualified professionals through the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of BC, or APEC BC, that must be employed in order to ensure that provincial regulatory requirements are followed. So moving on to the BC Geothermal Resources Act, just as a reminder, this permitting process would only be required if the waters that you are anticipating to deal with are going to be greater than 80 degrees Celsius. And anything below 80 degrees it does not require a Geothermal Resources Act permit. So this act is administered by the Ministry of Energy and Mines, and BC is the only province that has enacted regulations to administer geothermal rights. The definition that is used by the Geothermal Resources Act of what a geothermal resource is the natural heat of the earth and all substances that derive an added value from it. And this includes steam, water, and water vapor heated by the natural heat of the earth, and all substances dissolved in the steam, water, or water vapor obtained from a well, but does not include water that has a temperature less than 80 degrees at the point where it reaches the surface, or hydrocarbons. So the Geothermal Resources Act only provides subsurface rights to a geothermal resources, so you will still be required to obtain surface, land, and water rights if you are looking at using waters greater than 80 degrees. But again, if your project is only going to be dealing with waters that are under 80 degrees, you won't be required to go through the Geothermal Resources Act, but you will still be required to submit permits and licenses under the Land Act and Water Sustainability Act. So the referral process and tenure acquisition process for the Geothermal Resources Act is pretty involved and typically takes anywhere from 1 year or even longer. It could take maybe 2 years. And the reason for that is because the province reviews the requests for geothermal permit. So if you're looking at a land area that you would like to explore for geothermal resources, you submit that to the province, and then the province does an internal review and an external referral process where they consult provincial ministries, First Nations, and local and regional governments. And these any comments during this external referral process is then analyzed, and then if there are any conditions that are required in order to fulfill the comments that were submitted by these different organizations, they would be taken into account and included as part of the bidding process. So once this internal and external referral process is complete, then there is a notice of public tender. So as the initial proponent of an area where you may have been interested in developing a project for geothermal, that area is basically, once you submit it, it's basically publicly announced, and there is a notice of public tender, and these rights are disposed of by a closed bid auction. So this process is quite onerous for development in BC, and so when you look at the government website under Geothermal Resources Act, you can see that only a couple of handfuls of sales have occurred in the last 10 years. But it is still important to note that identifying the needs and comments of the different bodies, communities, and local and regional governments that are impacted by the exploration and development of geothermal resources is something that would need to be done throughout the stage of the process. So it is of benefit that it is completed at the beginning, but it's certainly something that hasn't led to an abundance of geothermal permit sales in recent history. So something to keep in mind. So that's the end of Module 6 and the permitting overview, and all of the details that we've gone through here are included in Section B of the Direct Use Geothermal Resources report, which is the roadmap. It's a separate chapter in the roadmap, and so if you would like more details with respect to some of the things we've covered in this module, you can refer to the roadmap.